Hi there, my name is Joshua Young. Many of you already know me. And today I'm going to make a special video that I have been trying to do for a very long time. And every time I've sat down to think about doing this, fear, anxiety, and other things have stopped me. Many of you already know my testimony about coming back to the Christian faith and how extraordinary and extreme those supernatural events were. And you're also quite familiar then with the demonic interactions that I was experiencing. And also, I've hinted pretty strongly at some of the things that happened in my teens and some of the other events that pushed me down the path toward atheism originally. And recent events and thought processes have pushed me to this point where I feel like it's time for me to share the rest of the story. These details are primarily for family and friends who want to know what was going on behind closed doors. You know, Jesus talks about shouting from the rooftops the things that you heard. And I am a firm believer that truth is a disinfectant. That when you share the truth, it shines a light on a variety of things and can be transformative, not only for yourself and your own healing, but it can also be helpful to other people. We oftentimes go through our lives with these little questions. Why did that person suddenly become depressed? Why did that person suddenly go crazy, right? What was it that triggered those moments? And we love to hear about the stories of people who come to faith or have a deliverance experience. But I think it's also important to talk about the things that have happened that have led to a person needing deliverance in the first place, especially when those things happen to a child or a young person, because people who are young are innocent and they're confused and they're not quite sure what's going on. And for a lot of people, I and others, you're faced with potential manipulation, social conditioning, and other things that can be difficult to understand until you get older. And, I'm in my 40s now. And some of these things that happened, 25 years ago are still affecting me today, daily. And they're affecting the relationships in my family. And I have been hearing that even to this day, family members are struggling with confusion. There's gossip going around. There are things that are being shared that are not true. There are things that have been covered up. And I think it's important to tell what happened. Because in many cases, a lot of these people are going to church and acting like good Christians. And I don't think it's right that people just do something or engage in something and then just get a free pass without any learnings or anything like that, especially when so many people have been extremely hurt. And so I want to talk today about what happened to Josh. I know many of you, I've heard people saying that. We wondered what happened to you. I've heard that many times. Josh, we wondered what happened to you. It was like everybody they knew that there must be more to the story than what was on the surface and what I was presenting to the world for many years when I was an atheist. And that's actually correct. So we are going to talk about that today. Before I begin telling the details of the story, just a little background. I have 4 younger siblings. I'm the oldest. My dad's dad was a pastor for many years, small town pastor. I grew up in a well, at least at the very beginning, what I thought was a very loving family. I had this idea when I was around 10 years old that we were like a Leave It to Beavers type of family. And I had this impression that we were different than other families, but that everything about us was better. And there was something about the Young name that held some form of like specialness or prestige. And it was brought up a lot of times at family gatherings that the Young name was something special. We would hear stories about the grandparents and stuff like that. And I remember my first good, positive spiritual experience was in my sister's room. I must have been around that same age, around 10 years old. And I was sitting on the bed and I was reading Galatians, if I remember right. I remember, you probably remember, we had this rule that in our family that you were supposed to read your Bible for 30 minutes before you could play video games for an hour. And so this was probably during one of those times. I don't remember exactly. I just remember sitting on the bed and reading Galatians and suddenly getting this overwhelming sensation of God's presence. It was a love and a peace and a joy that was more than I could imagine. And I was just absolutely enraptured by this feeling that God was in the room and that he was loving me and caring for me. As I started to get a little bit older, I remember that something was shifting. And I've talked about this a little bit on my story with the Stronger Faith, but I started to have severe doubts. Almost now what I would consider OCD. I am not quite sure when this started. I think it probably was in relation to a pastor at church or something like that, doing like an altar call, when the pastor gives this sort of a flamboyant call that if you don't accept Christ as your savior, you're going to go to hell. And I remember there was one pastor in particular, he used this phrase. He said that if you didn't remember the exact moment that you were saved, then you aren't saved. And you're probably going to hell. Well, I didn't remember an exact moment when I had accepted Christ or was born again. And I kept thinking, well, I'm believing the right list of things. So I've got the right list, and my behavior, I think, is pretty aligned with what Christianity is supposed to be, but I can't remember that exact moment. What is that moment supposed to be like? How are we supposed to know? And this began to just like eat at me, eat at my mind. This feeling that I might not be a real Christian. The doubt became very much OCD. And then around the time I was, let me think about this for a second. I was 11/12. I remember my parents were starting to very seriously consider go to a different church. We had been going to an evangelical free church in Wichita, Kansas. We were going, it was out on, I think it was West Street in Wichita, Kansas. There was an evangelical free church that was out there. And it was a decent sized church. I mean, I'm going to guess it was probably, oh man. I remember we had Awana and there were probably a couple hundred kids. So I'm going to guess that the church was probably 500 to 1,000 total people, somewhere in there. So it was a decent sized church. I don't remember a lot of focus on doctrinal issues or anything like that. It was pretty, I guess, run of the mill evangelical free church. And I was very happy there. I remember being very happy. I have some of my favorite memories from childhood were from the Awana program there. I remember, we would get a Cliff Bar at the time if we finished our full lesson for Awana and memorized the verses we were supposed to. We were doing lots of verse memorization, right? And the energy and the love that I felt in general at that church was actually pretty good. And so when we decided to leave, when my parents decided to leave that church, I was confused. I genuinely was. I asked them why. I had made my friends there, and over a series of conversations, whether accurate or not, the impression that I took away was that we were leaving this evangelical free church because they were being disobedient to God. In particular, my parents had become very convicted at the time about not being in debt. They thought that being in debt was sinful. Today, they don't hold that same view. but at the time they were very adamant that we shouldn't be in debt. Being in debt is sinful. And you should instead be trusting God to provide for you instead of just borrowing money from a bank. And so the impression given was that, well, we're leaving this church because the church was borrowing money to build a sanctuary. Now, it may very well be that this is just the answer that they gave me because I was a young kid, and maybe there was other stuff going on, but that was the impression I took away from that event. Well, there were other people that were also deciding to leave the church, primarily from their Sunday school class. And one of the families had one of my best friends at the time, Anthony, was in that family. So I was kind of excited at the idea of starting a new church. It sounded interesting. And the impression I took away, and I highly doubt this was intended, okay? But the impression I took away was there's hundreds of churches in Wichita. And I knew this because we would drive past 24 churches to get to this evangelical free church. There's hundreds of other churches in Wichita, but we need to start our own church because we're doing things better than other people. That was sort of the impression I got, was that we were going to do Christianity right. We were going to be better than all these, rather than starting these other churches, we're going to do our own thing and we're going to do it right. And I was young, I was naive, I didn't understand. And so there was a group of I think it was about 8 or 9 families at that point in time. All of my younger siblings probably don't remember this. I mean, my brother Ben was probably, he would have been 10-ish, right? And then all the others were just way too young to really be paying attention and know what was really going on. And I remember watching the formation of this church. It ended up being called Redeemer Bible Church. And I remember watching the formation of the church and just being excited. I was excited. I remember when my dad was chosen to be an elder at this church, right? And I do remember being a little bit confused because I was like, well, you don't need any special training. That's it. You start your own church and then you can just kind of become an elder. But I assumed that the other people that were involved knew something special about my dad, and that's why he was getting chosen, okay? And I remember being very proud of him, and I remember being very proud that we were gaining a stronger reputation, if that makes sense. We didn't have to be one of those, we would have more influence by being involved in a church like this, right? There were lots of conversations at this time about which Bible the church was going to recommend. I thought this was really fascinating. For some reason, the elders were at one point in time discussing, or at least this is what my 12-year-old mind picked up. They were discussing which translation of the Bible was going to be the best translation to recommend to everybody in the congregation. And they settled on the ESV version, the English Standard Version of the Bible. And I don't remember the full thought process on this, but I do remember being fascinated by the idea that the individual words are super important in the Bible. And there were examples given of verses in the Bible where certain translations translated it, quote unquote, wrong. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So some of the Bible verses might be slightly incorrect in certain English versions. So this sort of triggered this interest in biblical studies for me. I thought, well, I'm the oldest in my family and my dad's become an elder of this church. And I think it's kind of important for me to start to learn some of this stuff. And so that church got started. And it was right after that church got started that they were going to do a baptismal. We were going to go down to Harvey County, East Lake in Kansas. And there were a handful of us that were going to be baptized. If I remember right, it was only 3 or 4, but we were going to be baptized in the lake. And I remember our pastor at the time, Pastor Ward, was going to baptize us in the lake. And this would have been, I want to say this was May of 1997. Based on some of the details I've picked up from talking to other people, I think it was probably around then because it was spring. And so the weather was decent enough that we could be baptized in the lake and it wasn't too cold. Anyway, irrelevant. And I remember coming up out of the water feeling like I had done the right thing. I was a child of God and I was going the right direction. Just this feeling that God was looking down on me. And I think I told a couple of people this at the time. And then things started to get darker. I don't know how to describe it. Nobody had ever talked to me, by the way, during this entire time. Nobody had ever explained to me or talked to me about the concept of spiritual warfare. There was nobody who ever warned me about this type of thing. And my memories during this time, up until a couple years ago, were pretty fuzzy until somebody, a good childhood friend who was older during this time and actually involved in this church, in the founding of this church, helped me to piece together the dates and everything like that. And everything he said lined up once we kind of pushed stuff together. And we double checked with a couple other people as well, including his wife. And so we pieced this all together, and it would have been around it was Halloween of 1997 was when the murder of my dad's cousin, Anastasia Whitbells-Fuga, happened. And I hinted on this on my Stronger Faith video. And we went to Kansas City. You can still find information about this. You can find podcasts about this murder. I mean, it was pretty wild. I mean, it was crazy. And it was during that ceremony when I had that guy who turned around when I was thinking in my head, he's very evil, and he turned around and looked straight at me. I did not have any experiences that I know of before this where I had any sort of spiritual intuition. So I believe that was actually the first time where something noticed me, if you want to put it that way. There was something different about me. I didn't know what it was. How could I know? I'm 12. Nobody had ever talked about spiritual warfare and deliverance ever with me that I can remember around that time. Instead, what had happened was that somehow, and I haven't been able to get a full picture of this, that church became very focused on some very intense topics and being very intellectual. Now, the church had started with 8 or 9 families. I didn't know this, but at the time, there had been agreement when the church started that they would go 3 years, and at the end of 3 years, if they hadn't grown, they would disband the church. Now, I didn't know about this decision, okay? So 12 years old, go 3 years, disband the church if they haven't grown. Around the same time that incident with Anastasia occurred, there are several things that all converged together. The first was that the church had become fixated on teaching about and helping the Voice of the Martyrs, which is a organization that helps families that are and people who are being persecuted for their Christian faith in other countries. And that's fantastic. I'm like, that's great. And I remember we went down to Bartlesville, Oklahoma. I believe it was Bartlesville where the headquarters was, and got a little tour of a portion of the facilities. I remember there was a book publishing section, and we got to see where Richard Wurmbrand's book, Tortured for Christ, was being printed. And I think it was around that time that I got a copy of it. Maybe it was given to me. Now, I want you to pause for a moment. Those of you who have read Tortured for Christ, giving that to a 12-year-old, that book is dark. Okay, it's not darker than the stuff you can find on the internet really easily today, but that is a dark book. There is horrible stuff in there. I mean, we're talking stories of people being left in a torture chamber where there's nothing but starving rats, and they are chained to the wall or whatever, and then the rats have to eat through their stomach. We're talking grotesque, awful stuff. I read that book, and then I started to have basically waking nightmares. Psychologically, I was really messed up. I remember one Sunday at that church, it was me. So we had these Sunday school classes, right? And there was a small Sunday school class, and it was me and a couple other people around my same age, 12. I remember who they are. I'm tempted about what names to share here. I mean, I remember my good friend Anthony was there, and but anyway, the teacher was sitting there, and at one point I remember him pointing his finger at us and being like, "You kids don't understand. One of these days, someone is going to hold a gun to your head and is going to ask you whether you're going to deny the faith or you're going to be killed, and you need to be ready to give an answer." And I just remember sitting there like, I'm 12. What the heck? I want to play video games. Why are you pointing your finger in my face? I remember just being shocked. And I remember just thinking, oh my gosh, what if this happens? And then I couldn't stop thinking about it because I kept thinking about the verse where, I'd been reading the Bible, right? Obviously, I'd read the Bible a couple times at this point based on my, you add up half an hour a day for a year. I mean, that's 150 hours of Bible reading. And I knew that there were verses where Jesus says, if you deny me before the Father, I will also deny you before men. And I remember just being like, what if I spend my whole life being a Christian and then I reach a point where I deny Christ? It's all a waste because then I'm going to go to hell. Because Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before the Father. And I started to wrestle like a whole bunch with all of these passages. What I didn't know at the time was that I had discovered Bible contradictions, okay? For those of you who are inerrantists, apparent Bible contradictions. Either way, I'm a 12-year-old trying to piece together this complicated stuff through an English translation without any knowledge of Greek or Hebrew or any of that stuff, right? And I'm wrestling with this pretty much on my own. Occasionally, I would go to somebody in leadership at the church and say, I'm having a problem with this. But the answers I got were pretty generic, and they were kind of vague, to be honest. Someone would say, oh, well, that's just not the right way to interpret that passage. And I'd be like, well, yeah, but that's not what it says. I mean, it says, it straight up says, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before the Father. So like, if every word in the Bible is supposed to be important, and I take that straight literally, right? Then this means that you'd go to hell. So the answer is, I was starting even at 12, 13 years old, starting to see that some of the people that I respected as leaders perhaps didn't have answers for some of these questions. Well, I kept researching. As a part of, at this new church, we started a teen program for memorizing Bible verses and reading books and learning. So we met once a week. It was called Proteins, which now I look back and I'm like, did nobody think about protein folding when they named it? Anyway, it was supposed to be Pro-Teens, like for teens. Anyway, so I was memorizing Bible verses. I remember at one point, I recited back word for word, exact word for word. I think it was like 240 verses? It was something crazy like that. It was 200 something. I remember that because we broke it up and it was like you'd memorize a couple verses a week, right? And so we had gone a couple years, and I was nearing the end of that program, and it was like if you could recite every single one of the verses back to back in a row, you got like a big reward. Anyway, back up. I'm age 12, right? And I'm trying to piece together things about the world, and I'm just starting to understand things. And I'm learning about torture for Christ. I'm learning about this sacrifice, not sacrifices, people being killed for their faith. And at the same time, the church also decided that they were going to start teaching us about abortion. And I look back now and I'm just kind of in shock. This is like a absolute psychological shock for a 12-year-old. So one Sunday, there was a video on how abortion was performed, and it was created by an organization that was trying to show how evil abortion was to college campuses. Now, this is for college. This is made for, first of all, the video is made for college campuses, right? And they would put up these giant billboards, and they would discuss with people about the horrors of abortion. And I remember the leadership at this church decided that if you were 12 years old or older, you could stay in the sanctuary. All of the other kids would go out and they would go to their normal classroom. So I was the only one of my siblings that watched this video. And I still remember to this day, the searing image in my head of a tiny little baby, fetus, the size of a quarter, next to a quarter, and they were piecing together the pieces of this bloody baby back to figure out if they'd pulled everything out of the mother. And I sat there in the audience just shocked. I've got a focus on torture and not denying Christ if you're ever tortured for your faith. I have abortion stuff being put in my direction. I have doubts about my salvation. Would I ever make it? If I was tortured for my faith. And so every night, I'd sit there and I would be thinking about what if I was tortured for my faith? And I would visualize in my head being tortured, having that person put their gun to my head. And I remember being terrified that I might cave. And so I've got these two things going on. And then there was this massive emphasis on the evils of evolution. And at that time, I could probably look up and find out when this was, but Answers in Genesis came to Wichita. And Answers in Genesis came to Wichita. And I remember we actually met and hung out with Ken Ham for probably, I don't know, maybe an hour or something after the conference. And I remember my dad chatting with him. And I remember asking Ken Ham questions and we were going back and forth. And I remember being just absolutely convinced about how evil evolution was. And I came away from that conference fully believing that one of the primary lies that the devil was telling to everybody was that evolution happens. And that if we could defeat evolution, right, as a Christian community, if we could somehow prove that evolution wasn't true, then we would be able to win more souls for Christ, that we would be in a better spot to do that, right? And with that in mind, all of this kind of came to a head, and I remember becoming so psychologically disturbed. I was having panic attacks whenever there was communion at church. So the pastor would get up and announce, if you have any unconfessed sins, that you needed to confess those sins, so that you wouldn't, because if you didn't confess the sins, you might be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. It's a passage in one of the Corinthians. And so I was thinking, all right, while communion is being prepared, what if I miss something? What if I have a hidden sin, right? I knew from the Old Testament that there was something called a hidden sin. And so I was like, well, if I have a hidden sin, something I don't know about, or if I miss telling one of these sins, am I going to end up guilty of the body, the blood of the Lord? And in Corinthians, Paul says that this is why some of you have fallen asleep. So Paul is declaring that people have died because they mistook communion in an improper state, right? And I was afraid I was going to die. So now I've got a fear of communion, a fear that I'm going to miss about confessing a sin. I have these thoughts constantly about the horrors of abortion and the fact that I might be tortured for my faith, and I need to be ready to stand up for Christ. And I've got all this going through my head. And I remember one Sunday, I woke up and the sun was shining into our bed, our room. And for a brief moment, I had relief. I must have had a good night's sleep. And these torturous OCD thoughts had stopped. And I just sat there and just basked in this freedom from this constant OCD of thinking about these religious topics and trying to come to terms with how serious all this was. And I sat there, and then all of a sudden the thought popped into my head, it's Sunday. And this dread came over me. I was like, oh my gosh. And this thought came into my head. It was crystal clear. And the thought was, there's something wrong with this church. I knew that I had been happy at the previous church. I wasn't having this problem, right? And so I got out of bed and I was getting ready to go. And I was like, I can't go back to this church. There's something wrong here. There is something wrong. I wasn't having panic. I didn't know what a panic attack was, but I wasn't having these incidents, right? Before we started this church. So what's going on? There's something seriously wrong here. And I declared that I wasn't going to go to church that Sunday. And I was alone with a person in my family, and I got attacked and beat in a violent rage and ended up in the fetal position on the floor. And I remember I kind of blacked out for a period of time. And because I had disrupted the morning plans to go to church. And I remember, I have no many, I don't know how many times I was hit, because during that period, everything went dark. But I remember being hit on the floor, and then just like my brain just went, you have to ignore everything that's happening and just submit. Like, just submit. So I remember I stood up and I said, fine, I'll go to church. And this person apologized. I remember the apology, but quite frankly, after something like that, apology means nothing. I mean, it was over. I mean, I was psychologically traumatized, and I knew now that all of my questions, all of my doubts, everything like that, they were a problem, but they were a problem that I was going to have to solve on my own, and that I was going to have to deal with. And that I was an issue. Well, after that incident, I didn't end up going to church, if I remember right, but I remember the rest of the family coming home. And the first thing that was said was, Josh, we told everybody at church, and keep in mind, this is all my friends at this point. We'd been isolated. I mean, we were down to little homeschool families. This is all my friends. And it was publicly declared at church that they didn't know what was wrong with me, but that everybody should pray for me. And so I left that day in full belief that there was something wrong with me, and that I just needed to submit to whatever I was being told. And at that point in time, for those of you who are in my family, for those of you who have expressed, Josh, we knew something was off with you around this time, this is what happened. I became incredibly depressed. I have gone down the list of symptoms of people who are dealing with trauma, and I had every single one of them. One of the symptoms, I remember I was a happy-go-lucky kid, and I had this long list of things I loved to do. And there's a psychological word for what I'm about to describe, and I can't quite remember it right now. It starts with an A. But basically, I remember just being shocked. I was like, I am not getting any joy or pleasure out of any of these things. I wasn't enjoying anything. Nothing. Nothing gave me pleasure. Playing a video game? Nope. I was feeling guilty all the time. I started to have pretty frequent, recurring feeling of the presence of a dark being entering my room. I started to have waking nightmares. And by waking nightmares, what I mean is I would be trying to fall asleep, and I would suddenly feel this really twisted, evil energy enter the room, and it would torment me with images being placed into my mind, with guilt, with images and thoughts of hell and me going there, and it would just spin to the point where I couldn't sleep. And I was just losing sleep because this was just constantly going on. And I had nobody to talk to, because, when I opened up too much, guess what happened? So I knew that I was the problem, and I didn't know what to do at that point in time. And I was trying to read, and I remember I would just sit there, and I would open my Bible, and I would just read like certain passages over and over and over and over, like, the passage in Hebrew where it says that if you fall away, you can't be restored to repentance, or, other passages that I was just OCD trying to find something, because I was trying to find something in the Bible that would solve this lack of internal peace, right? And nothing worked. Occasionally I would have like a moment of just like a little bit of freedom where I felt this sense of joy, and it was such a relief. This would happen every couple weeks for a little period of time. But there was this cycle now of constantly just anxiety, and then it would reach a breaking point. I would have a panic attack. I was having panic attacks probably 2 or 3 times a week. And I didn't know what a panic attack was. At this point in time, my entire family believes psychology was evil. didn't want to study any of it. We were being told all philosophy is evil. There's that verse where it talks about empty philosophy in the New Testament. And so the idea of philosophy was evil, and I was just in this really dark spot. And it was right in the middle of that time that I had the dream about the dog lunging out of the darkness at me. So you can imagine my siblings are growing up and coming to age with this story that there's something severely wrong with Josh. And the finger is being pointed at me pretty regularly. And this was a recurring theme, and has been to this day a recurring theme in my immediate family. And it was awful. I mean, I would have to be left home. I would be left home with the kids, and I would, because I was the oldest, right? So I had the maximum amount of responsibility. And then repeatedly over and over and over, one of my siblings would act up. It was usually the same one every single time. And then, when my parents would come back home, they would believe the sibling and they wouldn't believe me. Repeatedly. I was being framed every single time that I was being too controlling. I was being too whatever. When parents would literally walk out the door and the siblings would just be scatter, even though there was stuff, my mom would give me explicit instructions. It was like, hey, Josh, you need to make sure the kids do X, Y, and Z. And when I come back, if it's not done, you're going to be in trouble. So I'm being told I'm going to be in trouble if I don't get these things done. And then as soon as they leave, the kids run off. Anyway, this isn't that big of a deal, but it just gives an idea of that. I want people to understand the sheer amount of psychological pressure that was being placed on me. I was in a situation where nothing I did was ever good enough. Ever. And then whenever I brought something up, I wasn't believed. And I was just like, well, what the heck am I supposed to do? So I just learned to kind of suppress everything. I started to suppress all my emotions. I remember, being like, I know I'm supposed to be a good Christian. I didn't know what depression was, but I knew that I wasn't happy and I was constantly doubting. Well, what's doubting? Doubting is a sin, right? So if I'm having questions, I'm doubting, that's a sin. So I'm just in a constant state of sinning. So then I would try to force myself to have more confidence, right? Try really hard to believe. And then I would feel like crap because I didn't understand the psychological effects of trauma. I didn't understand what was going on, why I was constantly in a state where I was never, ever fully happy, right? Then I had people telling me that something was wrong with me. So it's like a quadruple whammy at this point. And the story, everybody else was happy around me. And then when I would go to my parents and I would, try to explain to them, that I didn't know what was going on. I was told, Josh, you're going through puberty, all your friends are going through this. And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, my friends aren't talking about a demonic being that comes into their room at night and gives them horrid nightmare thoughts. My friends aren't talking about this thing, I didn't know what it was, OCD, where you're constantly nervous or scared about things. None of my friends are getting absolutely so terrified during communion that they have to literally go outside. There were multiple times where I would get up during communion and I would just go sit outside in a full-blown panic attack and just sit by myself because I had no idea how to deal with what I was dealing with. And I'd just sit there until the panic attack went away. That probably happened half a dozen times. I don't know. It's hard to say because after, you go through 100 panic attacks, you don't know what to do. Well, meanwhile, everybody else is acting like good Christians and trying to, it felt like the world was moving on and I was stuck. Well, at this time, by the way, oh my gosh, I've had a family member tell me that at least one of my parents was going around and saying that I was the perfect kid, that I was perfect. That was the word used. That was the quoted word used. So internally at home, I am feeling like an absolute miserable wreck. But externally, I was perfectly behaved. So being perfectly behaved was seen as perfectly good. And so if you were a behaved kid, if you were submissive, this was seen as good, right? I didn't know this was happening because behind closed doors, I was being told that I was arrogant. I was being told that I was focusing too much on myself. I was being told that I was, I wasn't doing a good job taking care of the kids when the parents left. I was getting, it was just this discrepancy between these stories is still mind-blowing to me during this time. And so for many of you family members, I know that were like, what was up with Josh? Because I know you were talking about this. I know you were talking about this because you've told me. Some of you have told me. So this video is for you guys. Like, that's what was going on. Okay, so let's fast forward because you start to go, okay, now it's just starting to make sense. And well, then it gets worse. Okay. So around the age of 15, now this would have been, remember the agreement that the church made at Redeemer Bible Church, they made this agreement that if they went 3 years and they didn't grow, they would take this as a sign from God that they were to disband the church, right? And so that's exactly what happened. At the end of the 3 years, there was apparently some pretty hard feelings, but they decided to disband the church. And I remember there were 2 or 3 meetings on Sundays where all the families just got together. And I remember actually the one time, because we all put our chairs in a giant circle. We were meeting in a gymnasium and we put the chairs in a giant circle. And what we were doing is we were discussing whether we should actually disband the church or not. And I do remember, the pastor becoming incredibly emotional and almost crying when he realized that there were people in the congregation that were thinking we should disband. And I remember leaving that feeling like we are amazing Christians, but which I understand this is weird. Okay, so pause for a moment. I had kind of at this point in time reached this sort of conclusion that if I suppressed all of these feelings I was having, right? If I just ignored them and I suppressed them and I pushed them aside, I could force myself into this intellectual state where I could intellectually I didn't think of it that way. Not play the Christian part. I could intellectually, robotically go through the motions of being a Christian. And there was also something kind of elative about big changes. Something about, and it may have also been that, quite frankly, at that time, not watching the church grow for 3 years, it was like, hey, this is exciting. It's something new. Anyway, I remember feeling excited about the prospect of this church ending, to be honest, and the prospect of something new, something different. It had been the same group of friends for 3 straight years. We hadn't grown at all, right? So you've got that as well. And I take that back. There might have been one family that also joined. There might have been one family. But I remember the actual numbers hadn't grown because I remember the Bears had left the church, even though they were involved in the founding of it. So some numbers might be off. There might be some small details missing here. I'm going completely off of memory. There's no script here, okay? Okay, so we disbanded that church, and then I remember it was like, oh, well, now we're in the process of looking for another church. We did not decide to start our own church this time. And we found a church in Wichita, and for the sake of, I'm not going to say what it is. I don't want to get, let's just say when you hear the rest of this story, you might understand why. So we end up going to this new church, and I remember entering this church thinking, well, I now have 4 years of getting the vibe that somehow we are doing Christianity right and other people aren't quite getting it. And, it's our job to train and equip all of the other people so that they can do Christianity right like us. I remember this was genuinely what I was feeling. And it's embarrassing to admit now, but that's kind of where we were at, or at least where I was at this point in time. And so we we joined this church, and several other of the families from the Redeemer Bible Church that had disbanded ended up going here as well, because they were all in communication with each other about where we should go next. And so I started going to the Sunday school class there. Finally, some new friends, right? Some new people. It was a fresh start or whatever. And I was still struggling with the panic attacks. I was still struggling with the doubts, but I wasn't in this stuck stasis now. I had new stimulation. I had new friends. And this new pastor, or the pastor that was at this church, wasn't, what's the word? Wasn't reinforcing a lot of the same attitudes that were so intense and serious, I guess you could say, as what we had been experiencing at Redeemer Bible Church. And I remember his name was Phil. And so I'm starting to enjoy myself again, but I'm also like having some really strange feelings at this point in time. And I'm going to say what one of these feelings is, because I have actually watched some other people. I know for sure I'm not the only person who felt this, okay? I remember one day suddenly wishing I had a different dad. I was at church, I was sitting there, and I was watching another adult male who was having a great time. He was jovial, he was outgoing, and I remember feeling, oh my gosh, I wish that person was my dad. Now, keep in mind, at this point in time, I had not connected together some of the experiences that I had had to know where this feeling was coming from. But I remember feeling immense guilt for even thinking this, okay? And I'm like, where is this coming from? And so again, I just tried to suppress it. I tried to suppress this thought. I'm like, where in the world is this thought coming from? And I hadn't really pieced together the elements of all the psychological pressures that I was experiencing at home and at this previous church with anything that I was experiencing. It was crazy because when you get raised in an incredibly restrictive environment where your information that is being fed to you is being highly limited, where you are being told how to think, you are being told what to think, and then you are also told repeatedly that you're in the right family and everybody's doing things biblically in this particular scenario. You don't really piece together any psychological trauma. You don't piece together the fact that maybe your panic attacks are associated with the way that you're being raised. You don't put any of this together at all, okay? And your parents don't do it either because they think psychology is evil, right? And on top of it, not only do they think psychology is evil, they are not learning anything about spiritual warfare. So when you tell them that you're feeling the presence of something demonic, they have no idea what to do, right? So complete isolation and, quite frankly, ignorance about all of this stuff was pervasive at this time. And I think that feeling that I wish I had a different dad was sort of my subconscious basically being like, there's something wrong here. And the thing that is wrong is not the church that you were going to. There's something deeper going on here, okay? And so I tried to suppress that thought. I was trying to suppress thoughts constantly, all the time. It was like, let's just suppress everything, like suppress all of the thoughts that are going against the program, right? Another great example of this at this time of suppressing of thoughts. I had told you that I was, we had Answers in Genesis come to our town, and that, I'd reached this point where I was like, evolution is one of the major things that's causing all the problems, even people rejecting Christianity. And so I was fascinated with it, but I was starting to become interested in becoming a Christian apologist at this point. And I remember, I think I found at a garage sale, it was a copy of On the Origin of Species. My dad at that time, by the way, he also was going through this period where he had bought a bunch of books on creation versus evolution and intelligent design and all that. And I remember actually seeing a stack of books on his desk at the bicycle shop. And so I was primed to be willing to study. I had read some of the books that my dad had. I think there was a book by Behe, and maybe there was a book by, was it Huras? I don't remember. But my dad had come to the conclusion, and I want you to understand here. I'm going to say something, and we're going to connect something together here. My dad had come to the conclusion that 6-day creation was the biblical and the only proper way to interpret the what was in the Bible. Consequentially, we all had come to the conclusion. Are you seeing the connection? Okay? We thought that we were thinking on our own. But the reality is that when you're in an environment like this, you're never thinking on your own because you're going to get in massive trouble if you disagree. So you're psychologically pressured to agree. And when your parents change their minds, it causes a lot of confusion. And I've watched my siblings go through this because your parents, you're like, what the heck? Like last month you were really against borrowing money and now you're borrowing money to buy a house. What in the world changed, right? Anyway, that's an aside. But we were supposed to fall lockstep. Every single thought, every single pattern of behavior were this little, homeschooled unit that was supposed to do exactly what we were told. And if you didn't, well, we know what happens. So this sort of, quite frankly, tyrannical environment was definitely a massive psychological negative influence. And I didn't understand what it was doing to me. But I'd found this book on the origin of species, right? And we're homeschooled at this point in time. So, I'd get my schoolwork done or whatever. And I started reading On the Origin of Species. And I remember that coupled with like looking through creation magazines. So you got like On the Origin of Species, creation magazines, and you're wrestling back and forth, right? And you're trying to piece together what's going on here. And I'm sitting there on a couch. I will never forget this. We had bought this new couch. It was this red couch with like these little, I don't know, like diamond things on it. And I was laying back on the couch and I think I was reading On the Origin of Species, or I had just read it and I set it down or whatever, but I was sitting there and I was thinking everything through. And the thought popped into my head that, wow, a really well-designed universe would be like generative, where if life forms could be designed that would adapt to the environment, then you could have every single planet could have its own unique life forms, and those life forms could form up. And then as the atmosphere and the weather changes, and as the planet moves further away from its star or whatever like that, the life forms could adapt to fit that environment. And this would be genius. And I remember just thinking, oh my gosh, this is so genius. God is a genius. And then panic attack started, because this was obviously sinful. I wasn't supposed to think like this. I wasn't supposed to think that anything even remotely like evolution could be true. So I suppressed. I'm like, I'm going to fight back these thoughts. These thoughts are evil. I need to push them down. Cannot think these thoughts. If people find out I'm thinking these thoughts, oh my gosh, I'm a heretic. I'm denying the faith. I need to be pushed away. So I'm suppressing thoughts about evolution now too. So, okay, but if you haven't been keeping track, we're up to about, 6 to 8 thoughts now that are constantly recurring that I'm having to suppress. We got the communion thing. You got evolution. I've got this demonic thoughts in my head. I've got the possibility I might deny the faith. I've got the question of whether I'm really saved or not. I've got like questions going through my head about, do I have any hidden sins? Did I miss something? Do I need to confess to somebody on this stuff? You got the tortured for Christ stuff going through my head. I've got like these images of, the abortion stuff. I'm psychologically kind of reaching the end of my rope. And so I'm not happy. And I'm barely smiling and I'm barely laughing. And I remember it hit this point where it was so bad that my friend Anthony and a group of other friends were sitting around making jokes in the foyer, I think it was after church. And I had a brief moment where I felt psychological release. And like I was actually happy for a brief moment. And I laughed at one of the jokes that was said. And every single person in the group turned around and looked at me and stopped talking with a shocked look on their face because I was finally laughing and having fun. And I remember the embarrassment I felt. There it was again. There was that shock. Oh my gosh, Josh, what, and I was like, what? And they're like, well, you laughed. And at that moment I knew, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me. This is that thing. What is wrong with me? What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Right? Oh, now all my friends are noticing that there's something wrong with me too. And so I decided, I was like, you know what? I gotta fix something. I gotta change something. I didn't know what panic attacks were, but I knew I was having them. I didn't know what depression was, but I was having that too. I was having all sorts of doubts all the time. I was like, you know what? Other people are fine. Why am I not fine? I'm going to force myself to be fine. Right? So that's what I did. I psychologically was just forcing myself, like, to put on a smile, go to church, shake hands, becoming this mechanical robot who's like acting out the happy Christian role. I'm going to be joyful. I'm going to be at peace. I'm going to do all this stuff. And I'm just going to act out this Christianese role, say the right things at the right time, etc. And it actually kind of worked, honestly. By worked, I mean it. I was able to just kind of learn how to suppress the panic attacks before they happened, how to circumvent them. I was reaching a point where, like, I guess people probably thought I was happy. I mean, so now we're entering, 16, 17 years old, and I remember Anthony and I got together and we started this Bible group. I wanted to teach Bible stuff. I mean, I've been reading it for years, and at this point in time, I was starting to discover that I'd probably read the Bible more than most of my friends, right? So it was like natural that what do you do? You're at church. If you want to move up, what do? You become a Bible teacher. You get involved in church activities or leadership or something like that. That's what I did. So we started this group called Real Group. I don't remember what REAL stands for. It's like reaching everyone. Oh man, what was it? It was kind of clever, actually, the acronym. I don't remember what it was. I could probably find the document somewhere, because what we did is we wrote up this document, and it was like our mission statement for the group, and we gave it to the elders of the church. My dad was one of them, and they reviewed it and they liked it. So what they did is the church leadership had agreed that we could meet in the parsonage. Now, this is fantastic because at this church, it was pretty small. So there were only, like, I don't know. I think at that point in time, I could probably actually name all of them. I think there were 6 to 8 that were sort of in that, like, upper high school / early college age group. And there were a couple of us that were already starting to take some college classes from a local community college, Butler Community College there. And so we started this Real Group, and it took off. I was just shocked. I mean, we actually hit this point where, like, at some point I think we had like 20 to 25, I think was our maximum number that we're meeting in this small parsonage, right? And we would get together, we would have some chatting time, maybe people would bring snacks or whatever, and then we would sing songs. So I or Anthony or some other people would play guitar, and then we would sing, and we would do that. And then somebody would give a lesson, and I gave lessons probably a third of the time or something like that. And I discovered I was actually pretty good at teaching, and people actually enjoyed my teaching, which was actually kind of a surprise. They liked actually listening to me, which was like, and this is the first time I'd done this. I didn't know what I was doing. So that was doing really, really well. Real Group was absolutely fantastic. And the reputation was incredibly good in the church for our group. Far as I know, we didn't have any scandals or anything like that. At least I never heard of any of them. I mean, maybe something happened I didn't hear about, but it was generally just a fantastic time. And I remember just being excited that we were pulling in these people from all over Wichita. And, well, oh boy, I don't remember all the timing of how all this stuff happened here, but around that point in time, a new pastor got hired. I didn't know this. but the previous pastor basically got pushed out. I don't know all the details, but as is usually the case, they get up and they announce that they're, things are changing and they need to move. And so this pastor and his family moved to another state. And they had just got done building a brand new house, so it was kind of odd. And suddenly, the church had gone through a very abrupt and decisive and anger-inducing transition from a congregational rule to an elder rule. Now, the reasoning at this time was that elder rule is the biblical form, right? Because the Bible talks about elders. It doesn't talk about congregational rule anywhere in the New Testament. So therefore, we need to switch to elder rule in order to be biblical and to do what God wants, to follow what is in the Bible. And so this elder rule transition happened, and there was this rumors that just started popping up about this guy named John MacArthur and the Grace to You program and all that. And I remember it was brought up pretty regularly that John MacArthur was one of the top, biblical sound teachers in America. And, he held to a strict literal fundamentalist position on scripture. And he was strong on the Reformed tradition. Reformed theology was becoming a thing at this time. And of course, I was learning all these terms. And so they decided, the elders did, that they wanted to hire somebody who had gone to John MacArthur's seminary. And they invited in this guy. And he must have been in his early 30s. And so he comes into the church. Oh man, this talking is making me thirsty. So he comes into the church, and I remember, let me think about this a second. So his first sermon that he gave was on a Wednesday night, if I remember right. I think that was it. And I was kind of excited. I mean, I was there at church, Sunday morning, I was managing the sound. So Sunday morning, I'm managing the sound. Sunday night, I am always there. Then Wednesday, was it Tuesday night or Wednesday night? Maybe it was Tuesday night. We had a real group. And then Wednesday, I was usually there too. And then also, whenever there was other stuff happening, I was there. So I was there on a Wednesday night when he gave this sermon. And I remember hitting the end of that sermon and just being weirded out. There was something off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Something wasn't right. What was it? Something was missing from this sermon. Intellectually, if I went down the list of the things he taught, he checked all the boxes. But there was like an essential component of what a sermon should be that was just gone. And I remember the sermon ended with this impassioned, generic plea that, if somebody in the audience wasn't a true Christian, that they should come forward, kind of an altar call thing. And I remember looking around the room and I'm like, does this guy, the only people who are here are Wednesday night attendees to church. These are all the serious people who already know this stuff. Did he think about that at all? Like his audience, what's going on here? It was so off the mark. But he checked all the intellectual boxes. He checked all the doctrinal boxes. Right. And I remember just being kind of like, why this guy? Well, I couldn't find anything particularly wrong with him. I mean, you check all the boxes. It's like just this feeling, this like disturbed feeling that something's not quite right. Well, at that point in time, again, I'm the oldest in my family, and I was starting to think about college, and I was starting to think about where to go to college. Well, one thing led to another, and this pastor was like, why don't we go to a conference in California, a John MacArthur focused conference, and you'll get to explore the seminary, and we can all sort of get to know the backgrounds that this pastor had been raised in the Grace to You sort of community and John MacArthur's seminary out there in, was it Pasadena? I think it's Pasadena. Gosh, this is a long time ago. So it was Anthony and I and everybody else. What we did is we got invited to go out and we drove. I remember we drove. We took a van. And it was the longest drive, but it was over a couple of days. And we get all the way out there. And I remember an incident that happened in the van. That was another one of those incidents where something felt off with this guy, this new pastor that we had hired. And keep in mind, I've been already teaching for this real group, right? So I've been doing a lot of study. And when I study hard. I mean, I dig into stuff. And I remember this pastor was sitting next to me. I was in the passenger seat and he was in the driver's seat, and there was everybody else, all the elders and Anthony were behind. And I remember some discussion came up about a theological topic. And this is a topic that I knew a little bit about. So I asked the pastor a question that I knew nobody really had the answer for, because it was one of those questions. So I was testing him a little bit here. I'd already felt this feeling that he was overly confident and that something was off. So I asked this question, and the correct answer to the question is, well, there's multiple points of view on that, and here they are. And there's really no one way to prove one way or another, but I lean this direction. That's what I was expecting as a response. Instead, his response was, well, Josh, we believe, and then he just starts saying stuff about what we're supposed to believe. And I just remember sitting there like, what are you talking about? We believe? Who the heck is we? I just met you. I don't know you from Adam. Like, you just started at this church, but now you're declaring that because I'm going on a trip with you to this church that I'm supposed to just agree with you on everything? And I was just really put off by this. It was like a form of arrogance where it was like, it's that, well, if you're going to do things right, you're going to agree with me. And you need to believe what I believe and exactly as I believe it. And this wasn't even like, for those of you who are following and are Christians, I believe this had to do with Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? And whether it was 4 or 5 point Calvinism, or I don't remember the exact details. I just remember it had something to do with Calvinism and Arminianism. So it wasn't even like an essential doctrine, so to speak, if that makes sense. But he was insisting that if I was going to be right, I was going to agree with him. Anyway, we go out there. We go to this whole John MacArthur conference, and I remember Anthony and I bought these little Bibles, and the little Bibles were ESV, because we agreed ESV was the right translation, remember? And or the best translation. They weren't opposed to other translations. I just want to make that clear. It was just the ESV was supposed to be the best one. And I remember Anthony and I were enamored with John MacArthur, and I remember we went up afterwards and we had John MacArthur sign our Bibles. And I look back and it's just so cringe now. I mean, I cringe at this. I just absolutely cringe at this. Like, John MacArthur was a celebrity, and the Bible, like, he had written the Bible and we were going to have him sign it. Well, he signed it for both of us. And I think he just put in some generic Bible reference or something and then signed it. And I remember being fascinated by the fact that John MacArthur had a ton of bodyguards around him. And I remember hearing that he was getting death threats. And in my mind at the time, I thought, oh, he's getting death threats because he's following the Lord so closely. For those of you who know more of the story, this might be kind of funny. We won't get into that now, but just good. Anyway, all right. So I was like, but why does a man of God need bodyguards? I mean, if you really trust God and angels are protecting us and the Holy Spirit is behind us, the Apostle Paul didn't have bodyguards, did he? Why does John MacArthur need bodyguards? I just remember just thinking that was kind of weird, because we would oftentimes make fun of the Catholic Church and be like, why is the Pope in this, why does he need bulletproof glass? If he's actually chosen by God, why does he need bulletproof glass around his little car when he's driving through the crowds? But here it was John MacArthur, our hero, and he has bodyguards protecting him. It was strange. Anyway, well, over the next couple of weeks, we go back, or next couple of months, I'm not sure about the timeline here, and this is when things started to get darker. I started to notice this pastor doing things that the new pastor we had hired that just rubbed me really wrong. And I'll tell some examples here. I remember we were in the sanctuary this one day, and the pastor was jovially talking to some of the other elders that were was it elders or just adults? I think it was just a couple of the other adults. And I was listening to them talk, and they were all joking and having fun. Well, the pastor's daughter needed to go to the bathroom or get a glass of water or something. It was something very innocent. I remember that. And she's like, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. And he turned around and he snapped at her. Like, snapped at her until I could see the shocked look on her face. Like, what did I do wrong? You don't dare interrupt me when, I'm talking to other people and stuff like that. You need to behave. If I'm talking to people, you don't. And I was just like, what the heck? And she sat there in just shock, and she started quivering. Her lips started quivering, right? And I was like, whoa, did other people see this? It was like one of those moments where, like, Twilight Zone or something. You look around and you're like, am I the only one seeing how mean that was? That was just mean. Why was he mean to her? He didn't need to be mean to her. And he went from being mean to her and flipped his head back, and then instantly, without skipping a beat, switched back to his jovial character, making jokes and stuff like that, while she sat there almost at the point of bawling. Okay, well, that was one incident. And then there was another incident where this pastor was chatting with a couple of us in the foyer. And I remember he was telling a story about a homeless person that came into church. And apparently this homeless person had come into the church and was asking for some food or some clothing, maybe asking for money initially. Most homeless people ask for money first off, but I remember it wasn't like, they weren't asking for a lot. If I remember right, it was like less than $100 or something like that. And I remember my first thought was, wow, we get to help somebody in the local community. We can give them money. That's great. Maybe they'll come to church on Sunday. That was my thought process. It was like, okay, if you be nice to them, maybe they'll be open to coming to church, and then we can teach them the gospel. I remember this pastor, with a smile on his face, said, well, I told them they needed to hear the gospel. I'm like, okay. So then he said, I shared the gospel with them. And I said, are you willing to accept Christ as your Lord today? And the homeless person was like, no, not right now. I just need some food and some support right now. And the pastor said, well, then you're not getting anything, and kicked him out. And he said this the pastor is telling us this story as if he needed to be praised. He had a smile on his face, like he was proud of himself for standing up for the gospel and kicking this homeless person out and not giving them any money or any food or clothing. And I was just like, what the heck? Well, you have to remember at this point in time, it's like, I can't push back because we believe, right? Like this sort of like, I'm feeling the psychological pressure of this control. I'm like, well, that's odd. Something isn't right about that. Well, then the pastor, there was another incident that occurred that's actually worth saying. I had become friends with a guy who was mentally disturbed. I'll just straight up say it. But he was actually a fairly nice guy. This guy had started coming to church. He wasn't asking for anything or anything like that. I remember he told me he had permanent short-term memory, that situation where everything's in your short-term memory, and it was really affecting him, right? And so it was psychologically messing with him really bad. And he started coming to the church, and he was a little odd. But I remember just thinking, oh, well, here's a person we can help, right? Like, this is great. Let's try to help this person out. After being friends with him for like a couple months, I remember suddenly the church leadership getting up in front of the congregation during like a Wednesday night. And they said, this person, we have an announcement we need to make. And they publicly disciplined this person in front of like the whole congregation, like a shame, a public humiliation. But the crazy thing was, he wasn't even there. This is just like a formal exercise to publicly kick him out of the church. And the reasoning was he had been struggling with alcohol and he hadn't overcome his alcohol like quick enough. As far as I know, it had only been a couple months. Maybe it was a little longer. And I just remember being shocked. And like, you combine all these together and I'm like, this is really calloused. This is like my way or the highway, no sympathy, do what I say or you're gone attitude. And I just remember like, there's something wrong here. Well, then the straw that broke the camel's back. Real group had been going fine. Remember, we had written up this document. We'd already gone to the leadership at the church. They'd all agreed on it. Everybody was talking great about it. We were having lots of people come. It was like, 15 to 25 people, depending upon the day. I mean, sometimes there's less, I'm sure, but, we had a lot of friends in the group. And suddenly, one day, the pastor gets a hold of me and he calls me into his office alone. And I come into his office in the middle of the day. It was like it wasn't when nobody else was there at the church. So I drove over there and I go into the office and I sit down and he praises me for how well the real group is going. And then he lets me know that there are going to be some changes. And he said, we have decided that needs to be an elder present at every one of your meetings. And I was like, what? Okay, who's we? Oh, the elders. The elders and I have decided there needs to be an elder present at every one of your meetings. And I was just kind of thinking through, first of all, this delivery and the situation absolutely creeped me out. Nothing bad had happened. We'd already had the entire church leadership agree on this entire thing. So I was like, did we do something wrong? Oh, no, Josh, you didn't do anything wrong. We just need someone there to make sure that things that are being taught are correct, are biblical. Now, you got to remember, I'd already had this discussion with him where I knew that he was insisting that his opinion was the correct one on a topic that there really was no way to prove. So I'm feeling this pressure now. And I'm like, if you have a college group that meets together in a small house and you're having a great time and there's some like 55-year-old elder that shows up in the corner and is just kind of hanging out, monitoring to make sure that you don't say a sentence that's wrong. I mean, it's what is this? Is this like Soviet Russia? Are we trying to monitor things? You don't trust me, right? That was what I was feeling. I was like, how are we doing? We've had this thing going for, anyway. All right, you get it. Anybody who's like remotely emotionally intelligent has already figured out what is going on here. So I kind of gave some pushback and I was like, well, I don't know why that's necessary. And he threatens me. And he basically says, look, Josh, this is the way it's going to be. And if you don't do this, then we're going to have to put you under church discipline. Well, I had just watched this guy get publicly humiliated in front of the church and then kicked out. Okay, and he wasn't even there. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to be put under church discipline for simply not it made no sense. It felt like a snake was wrapping itself around and was trying to constrict. And it was just like, ugh. Now keep in mind, at this point in time, again, right, I was actually starting to be happy, right? Real group was one of the few things in my life that actually made me happy at this point in time. Because I felt free. I felt like, oh, wait, I can hang out with my friends. We can have a good time. We're learning about the Bible. We're able, I was organizing some outreach activities that we were having, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we had gone to share the gospel at the mall, for Pete's sake, okay? So I couldn't understand where this was coming from. It made no sense. Well, I put all of these incidents together that I had seen, and I came to the conclusion, based on the pastor's own teaching, he was teaching in Matthew on what you're supposed to do if you see a brother sinning. And what are the steps? Well, you're supposed to go to the brother first, right? As your first step. Well, I'm like, I must have been like 18 years old or something at this time. And, so this pastor would have been, oh gosh, how old would he have been? Upper 20s? Early 30s? I mean, he wasn't like that much older than me. I mean, I think about the 30-year-olds I know now, and it's like, geez, like they don't know anything. 40-year-olds, I'm 41. What in the world do you know by the time you're 40? Nothing. But anyway, that's beside the point. So I decided to meet with him. I'm like, I'm going to follow what the pastor himself said about what you're supposed to do if you see some behavior that's inappropriate or incorrect. And my whole point was to sit down with this pastor. And what I was going to do is I was going to, show him that I thought that his behavior was unloving and that it was calloused, and that there was a better way to do it, and he could probably communicate more clearly and be more loving and more patient with people. That was my goal. Okay. So I thought it through and I was like, all right, we'll meet. And we met at the Starbucks on Amazon and 21st in Wichita. And so again, alone, big mistake. I look back now and I was so naive. So we meet alone in this Starbucks. And it started off with me kind of opening, if I remember right, I opened the Bible to the passage in Matthew. And then I was like, hey, it says you're supposed to talk to your brother. And then I said, hey, I want to talk to you because I feel like some of these things that are happening don't make sense. And I think some of them are unloving. And he flew into a rage. He started yelling at me. He started telling me that, Josh, if you don't just submit to what we have decided, you're going to be put under church discipline. He threatened me that I could even be kicked out of the church. And I was like, what the heck? And he's doing this. By the way, keep in mind, we're sitting there in a populated Starbucks. There's baristas watching us. There are people sitting in these other tables. And he's saying this out loud, so everybody can hear in front of this place. And when I realized that he was just not listening and that he'd flown into some sort of rage I couldn't understand, I just stood up, grabbed my Bible, and walked out to my car shaking as I'm walking out to the car. And I go and I have my little white Honda Accord. I love that thing. And I get in the car and I just sit there and I'm like, what the heck just happened? What on earth just happened? Okay. So I start to drive home. Home wasn't very far away and I'm freaking out. And I decide, okay, what do I do? I decide I'm going to call my dad. And I'm like, well, my dad's an elder. He was probably involved in this decision. I'm going to explain what just happened. Obviously, yelling at somebody publicly in front of everybody at Starbucks and threatening to kick them out and ruin their life, basically, because everything in my life was revolved around his church. Probably not an issue, especially when I was trying to communicate to him that he needed to be more patient and more loving, right? And unfortunately, for reasons I still don't understand, and Dad, if you watch this, I still don't get this, you sided with him. And I don't know why. It broke my heart. It completely destroyed me. This is now the, half a dozenth time where I'm trying to bring something forward. And I'm just like, I'm not being sided with at all. So again, I'm back in the position of I just need to submit. And I'm like, what in the world did I do wrong? Okay, I went to him privately. That's step one, right? What's step two? You're supposed to bring someone else with you. And I try to go to one of the elders and then I'm getting shut down. Well, this made me really sad. And what it did is it just opened my eyes to power in the church. And power and control. And it was the first time that I think I saw a power struggle so clearly outlined in front of me. And it didn't really fully come in my consciousness. It was bubbling up. But I realized that there was something going on with the fact that the group was actually doing really well and that people liked me. That was a threat. Somehow. Now I understand that, well, we'll get to that. I know what's going on now, and I'll get to that more as we go through this story. But I'm going to get some more water here real quick. Well, at this point in time, I had not decided where I was going to go to college. I think I had gone to Butler Community College and I'd graduated with a associate's in science or something like that. And I was involved in computer science stuff and I had already learned how to program pretty well. And I had done a pretty good job of suppressing all my panic attacks and everything. I had basically turned into an intellectual Christian where everything was in my head. All my emotions and everything were dead and then suppressed. And so even when I was acting happy, I was acting happy. I had moments where I was happy, but for the most part, I was a shell of a person. I wasn't really fully myself because You can't suppress emotions for year after year after year and have your will constantly destroyed like this without it having negative effects. And so you don't become a fully integrated person. You're not fully, you're not a whole, right? Well, this was around the time that I started to be like, okay, there's a problem. I went to this church, actually. I started dating this girl at the time who went to a church that was Pentecostal. And I remember being baffled by the fact that they were really happy, but they believed different than us. And I went to her church, got to know her and her family, and I was just so confused. I was so confused. They were so much more gracious and merciful to people. They didn't bring the hammer down when people sinned. They didn't kick people out of the church for thinking just slightly differently. And I just remember being like, what in the world? Like, this is so different. But I found the judgmental part of me now had already been established. I started another Bible study. I actually started 2 other Bible studies. I had 3 at one point in time. There was one in El Dorado, there was one in Hutchinson, Kansas, and there was one in Wichita. And I was actually, I'd established them. It was almost like little church plants. And I would like go back and forth between them throughout the week, and then they would meet on different days. And eventually they kind of ran themselves to some extent. And I'm studying the Bible, and I remember actually, I remember I was reading Hebrews and I was studying it deeply. And one of the things I became fascinated by was all the back references to the Old Testament, right? And so I'm looking at these verses, and my Bible, by the way, I don't have it anymore. But the Bible was so marked up. I like underlined, I'd figured out this system to mark things and to cross-reference stuff and everything. And I was like, this Bible was full of markings. And I remember looking back at some of these verses in Hebrews and looking in the Old Testament, and I remember just becoming a little bit confused. Because some of these references to Old Testament verses don't really line up. Like, you read the quote where it says, as it says in the scripture, and then you look back at the verse in the Old Testament, and I was like, well, that's weird. That verse in the Old Testament isn't talking about what the author of Hebrews is saying. And I was just I was just kind of like fascinated. I was like, why did these verses, like, they look kind of like they're taken out of context? Now, and it might be worth noting here, I did take a couple online classes from Moody Bible Institute. There were online classes, and I took them, I don't know, it must have been 1920 or something like that. So I knew a little bit about interpreting scripture, but I was trying to understand how this stuff worked, and I'm running into problems, and I just thought it was weird. I was like, wait, why is nobody else seeing this stuff? Now, it hadn't really occurred to me that most people don't even read their Bible. They say they read it, but most people don't actually read the thing. So they go to church and they just expect that the pastor is going to tell them what it says, and then they go throughout their week. So I'm going through, and I'm starting to notice some of these things, and the thought is being planted in my head, I should probably go to Bible school. I got to find the answers to these questions. So maybe if I go to Bible school, I'll find some of these answers. And I'd also built up this giant list of questions from all the doubts I'd had over the years. Things like, what about hidden sins? And what about being tortured for your faith? And what happens if you deny Christ? Do you lose your salvation? Can you lose your salvation? No, maybe you can't lose your salvation. I mean, like, the list of questions, like, you know what I'm talking about, right? And so I remember I'd sort of put to rest the issues with the pastor, and I can't remember why. I was still concerned about some things, but I was starting to just kind of be like, I'm over it. I'm probably going to move or go to a college or something like that. I'll deal with those problems later. And I remember Anthony and I decided right after I was laid off from a job in El Dorado, Kansas, that we were going to move to Denver area. And so we decided, let me think about this for a second. he had gotten, I think, he got accepted at a tiny little school in Greeley, Colorado. And it was this tiny little school that had like a few students. I mean, it was again, if you aren't noticing a pattern here, tiny little churches, really tight enclaves with a few homeschool families with very strict doctrinal requirements. So this was a tiny little church out there in Greeley, Colorado, and he got accepted to that college. And I just remember being like, that's kind of weird. It was a pastor of a church who was also the president of the college, and he's also the main teacher of almost every single one of the classes. There was almost nobody else teaching any classes. It was just him. So my friend Anthony goes out to this college, and around this time, his mom got cancer. And it ended up being terminal. And I remember I was out living in Denver. So what happened was he got accepted to college. I go out to Denver. And I remember this interaction with a family friend named Taylor. He let me stay at his place for a little while. And I was trying to convert Taylor to Christianity. And instead, Taylor introduced me to a philosophy book and drinking beer and wine. And so it's my first little foray outside of my hometown, right? And for those of you who are highly controlling parents, your first instinct of me saying this is, oh my gosh, he's going to get involved in sin, right? And for those of you who have grown up in a highly controlled environment and you know exactly what's coming, okay, you're like, oh yeah, this is predictable. You can't lock someone down that tight and control all their information flow and all of their behavior without them having an explosion at some point. Anyway, so I'm out there, and Taylor introduces me, and he gives me a book by Descartes. So I'm reading this book by Descartes. My friend Anthony is off in this like tiny little school. And I remember a couple of incidents happened with him. So not everything that happened to me. Some of these things happened to friends. And in this case, I remember there were two things in particular that happened with Anthony that really affected me. So Anthony was this jovial, bubbly, outgoing guy who, I mean, he was so much fun to hang out with. All the girls loved him. And I remember at this school, they had really strict rules about female-male interactions. And I remember Anthony had a phone call with a girl at the college and was on the phone with her for an hour. His punishment, because he didn't get permission, was that he was grounded for a month. At least this is how the story was told to me. And I remember just being like, what the heck? That's it? Again, you're talking extreme, almost tyrannical measures to control people. If you aren't noticing a pattern here, this was everything growing up. Tyranny. You do exactly what I say or I am going to squish you like a bug. This was what I grew up with. Everything. But it wasn't just me. It was all the other people too that were involved in our group. And so I was like, what in the world? Like, you got grounded for like a month for talking to a girl on the phone? They weren't even sleeping together. Like, what the heck? This could have been so much worse. Well, that really disturbed me. And then to top it off, his mom passed away. And his mom was one of the sweetest people in the world. At least I thought she was. She was very sweet. Always very nice. Always very, huge lover of hospitality. Very kind to everybody. Incredibly giving. And so she passes away. And I remember Anthony asked for extra time to finish his homework because his mom had passed away and he was really struggling. And the principal of the school said no. And I remember just being like, this school has 5 students. His entire life revolves around going to your sermons in your sanctuary and then walking to the back of the same building to go to class And then he sleeps in a room in the back of this place, and his mom just died. And you can't give him any extra time to finish his homework. Predictably, it was at this point that Anthony started to go, quite frankly, he started to lose it. He started to lose it. And I watched this all happen, and I was like, I do not blame him. He was just falling apart at the seams. So Anthony, if you ever see this, if you ever watch this, just know my heart broke when I saw this happen. And I didn't agree with anything that was going on. And I wasn't knowledgeable enough to know anything about narcissism, about controlling relationships, or cult behavior. Well, I got my first job. And my first job was at not my first job, my bad. I got my first job at an official, sort of corporate company. Everything that I had up to that point, I'd probably had 6 to 8 different jobs. We're not at large organizations, right? And I remember getting at this job, and I was fascinated by how nice everybody was. So you got to keep in mind, I got my friend Anthony, whose mom dies, and he can't get a few extra days, right, to finish his homework. I have this environment where I'm being told I'm going to be kicked out of a church if I disagree with a tiny decision. I've got a pastor who berates his daughter, right? Berates his daughter if she slightly interrupts him during a conversation. And I've got an environment where I am beat because I decide not to go to church one Sunday. And now I'm in this environment where everybody's having fun. We would play foosball. Everybody was being nice to me. Nobody seemed to have any of the strange tics, vocal tics and the confusion that I was observing among all of my friends. And none of these people were having, these panic attacks that I had been having. And I was they actually seem fairly happy. They actually seem like they've got part of their life together. But I was well, I'm a Christian though. And so I'm going to try and witness to them. But I remember feeling this cognitive dissonance. I was what in the world's going on here? Well, so I decided to go to Moody Bible Institute. So I quit my job. I got accepted at Moody Bible Institute, and I decided to go out there to Moody Bible Institute. And I'm not going to get into all the details that I did on A Stronger Faith, but basically I ended up rejecting Christianity after I studied and studied and studied at Moody Bible Institute. I started piecing things together. I wasn't getting the answers to my questions, on these verses in Hebrews and how they were not referencing Old Testament verses properly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, I was just getting more and more questions. The questions were now stacking up to the point where I was this whole thing's falling apart. I'm I've got a pastor back home who's power hungry, and he's just using manipulative power tactics in order to gain control. I have, as soon as I brought up some of my questions, I remember one time at the school, I sent an email to a family member and I said, hey, I'm starting to think a little differently about X, Y, and Z. And I think it probably had to do with biblical inerrancy or something along those lines, because I was starting to notice genuine problems. And the response I got was basically, I still can't believe this to this day. The response I got was, well, Josh, maybe you never understood the gospel in the first place. And then this person just started to outline the gospel like I had never read the Bible before. Absolutely, just completely insulting. What in the world? You just ignored everything I told you, and then you reverted to a script like a robot. It felt robotic. It didn't feel like it was real. It felt like there were no emotions behind it at all, there was no actual thought. And I started to feel like I was in the Twilight Zone, and I was looking around, and everybody I knew was acting out like they were in a play, and they were just saying the things they were supposed to. Nobody was actually thinking or alive. They were just well, I'm supposed to, I must believe like this. I must say this sentence when this person says that sentence. I have to insert praise God at end of sentence where a good thing happens to me. I started to observe this, and I'm these people aren't real. They're not actually alive. They're not thinking for themselves. I just remember being like baffled. Well, eventually I became an atheist, like I mentioned on A Stronger Faith, and in large part, these are the stories. And so now if you're wondering what happened to Josh, that's what happened to Josh. That's what I grew up with. So you can imagine that when I come back to faith, right, I'm in complete shock because I'm like, I'm not going back to that. I am not going back to a religion that berates a little girl until she cries. I am not going back to a religion that kicks people out of the church, right? Because when I became an atheist, I started to find out about all these people that were being kicked out. That pastor ended up becoming, oh my gosh, like the story after story after story. Because whenever somebody got kicked out of the church, they would get in touch with the other people who were kicked out of the church. And just so you guys know, in my family, this is how I got all this info. Okay? I was collecting info from all the stories of the people that were kicked out of church. You guys were still going there, and you probably just naively thought that when you kicked people out, they were just gone and they were no longer your problem. Everybody talked to each other. They didn't die. They get together on Facebook and they chat and they share news about what's going on. So, for example, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit worked up. This period was just insane. So I became an atheist, and one of the elders at the church basically got kicked out. And the story that went down was absolutely insane, by the way. So apparently the elder, the pastor figured out that this elder was a problem. I'll put it that way. Because this elder was starting to notice that the pastor was unloving and was starting to question some of this pastor's motives. Exact same thing that was happening with me, right? So as soon as this elder started to notice this pastor was acting this way and started to like hint at this stuff, this pastor got angry, got upset. And what he did was he actually started to use some other friends of mine. These were actual people I knew, okay, that admitted this, as spies on this elder. And if any of you are wondering about this, because I know some of you are like, oh, Josh, you're misremembering. I can find these people and I can get them to like talk about this, okay? So the pastor was using these people as spies to spy on this elder to try and catch him in teaching something wrong. This sound familiar? What did the pastor want to do with me? He wanted to plant an elder to see if things were being taught correctly. This was just a strategy. This is just a power strategy. You nail someone on a doctrinal issue and you can kick them out of the church. You can get rid of them, okay? So for some of you who are wondering why I'm not like huge on just knowing all the Bible verses and stuff like that and becoming like really biblical and stuff like that, is because I watched as Bible verses were used as weapons to hurt people, to kick people out of the church, make up trumped up charges. And that's what happened. So here's what happened. This pastor, with the other elders, I don't know how they decided this, but decided this guy's got to go. Disagreed on a few issues and was noticing the pastor was being unloving. So it was like, all right, we got to get rid of him. So the pastor went to this elder and basically said, look, you need to write a letter of resignation and submit it because you're going to be gone. So the elder writes this letter of resignation, and then the pastor reads it, and one or two of the other elders, and they say, oh, well, we don't like some of the things you're saying in here. Okay. Well, you need to rewrite the letter and remove this stuff and say this instead. Well, obviously this guy refused to rewrite the letter because he wrote the truth. So he gives them the letter. Now, here's what happened. This is insane. I want you to like think about this for a second, how insane this is. Like how tyrannical and almost like communist Russia or like some sort of mafia this was. This is like a mafia tactic. What they did is they took the letter that he submitted and they reworded it to make him look like he was confessing to a whole bunch of stuff, and then they read it in front of the entire congregation. He and his wife were sitting there in the congregation, and while they were sitting there, the family that was in front of them, I'm actually related to them now through marriage, turn around and they say, we know that that letter isn't true. And then they stayed at the church. What the heck? Like, you literally watch mafia level corruption of lies to kick people and get rid of someone. And then you're like, well, we're going to stay at the church. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, you're putting up with this like that? Anyway, I'm sorry. This is crazy. Anyway, so this stuff was going on. Now, keep in mind, I had just become an atheist at this time. And I'm hearing stories like this. And the stories start pouring in about potential abuse. So we're not talking like, we're talking about familial abuse and other things that were going on at this church with this particular pastor. And one of the stories that came out at that point in time was that there was a woman whose mom was a battered wife. And so she knew all of the psychological signs of a battered wife, and she noticed that the pastor's wife was exhibiting all of these signs. So she tried to bring it up. She was roundly ignored. They left the church. This is an example of another story that I heard, by the way. So when one of these people, one of these psychopathic pastors takes power, and they get rid of all these people, all the people they get rid of tell their stories, and they come together, okay? I'm bringing this up because right now, there's an effort by some members in my family to try and say that I'm misremembering things, okay? No, I'm not misremembering things. Or one of the accusations that was made against me was, Josh, there's no possible way you could have known that. People talk. That's how I get this info. People tell me. I have conversations with other people. I mean, and it just blows my mind. This cult-like mentality. And quite frankly, I do think the church was turning into a cult. You don't have spies. You're not kicking people out over tiny doctrinal issues. And unless you're starting to exhibit cult signs. All right, so at the same time, all right, while I'm watching this happen, I had become an atheist, right? I had left this entire church environment, right? So I'm leaving this church environment. I am trying to piece my life back together as an atheist now, and I get a message. I get a message from a guy who had been attending the church. Now, this kid at the time, by the way, heartbreaking amount of abuse growing up. And this kid was really struggling. And he had made some friends at the church where this pastor was at, my family's church. And he messages me on Facebook. And he says, Josh, I don't know what's going on. Can you help me? Now, keep in mind, he was struggling. And he says, can you help me? And I'm like, okay, what's going on? And he says, your brother won't let me talk to the elder's family that had been kicked out. Won't let you talk to them? Like you're not allowed to chat with them? And he said, no, your brother is insisting that I'm not supposed to, my brother is insisting that I'm not ever supposed to talk to them again because they were kicked out of the church. I got furious. I messaged my brother. I called him an a-hole and I was like, what on earth are you doing? This is insane. I started telling him this is cult-like tactics. I'm thinking this, all of my suspicions that there was no Christ-like love are now being confirmed right in front of me. And I'm thinking, what the heck is this crap? So I've got that going on. Then as I'm wandering more into atheism, right, I get that email, the random email from somebody in my parents' church. And the email was some guy, and he says, Josh, I could probably find it. Probably should have found it before this video. But he says, Josh, you don't know me, but I go to your parents' church. And I've been watching how they treated you when you became an atheist. Because apparently there was a lot of gossip and a lot of backtalk going on behind the scenes. From what I understand, a lot of it wasn't necessarily true. But some of it wasn't just, I was like, what in the world is going on? Because I needed to be the scapegoat. I needed to be the person who was wrong about everything. They needed to keep people from talking to me, quite frankly, because I had dirt, right? I was on the outside. Well, so this guy emails me and he's like, Josh, I see what's happening. He said, I attend your parents' church and I don't believe any of this, but I watched how they treated you and how awful it was, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and keep coming into these pews. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. All of this, like, it just blew my mind how quickly, within like a few years, this entire church had turned into like a cult-like environment. It didn't take any time at all. So I would try to tell people in my family, like I would try to message my family members that like, hey, this is not right. That what you're doing isn't good. This is cult-like, here's why, here's the list of signs that you're in a cult, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would get roundly insulted. The stories that were being spread were probably not great. And I just remember being baffled. I'm like, how do I don't know these people. I don't understand why they're acting this way. This is crazy. I was absolutely heartbroken too. I was like, my brother's acting this way? My brother is telling people they're not allowed to contact other people? I was like, do I know these people? I just couldn't comprehend it. So I became an angry atheist. And, consistently was getting more and more stories from back home. And eventually, about 8 years later, of me I had to suppress a lot of stuff. I remember I was so angry. But I was angry because I was watching people cover stuff up. I was watching people go to church, put on their Christian smiles, and completely ignore solid evidence of abuse that was happening, and not listen to warning after warning after warning. And then turn around and tell everybody that I was going to hell. Like, what on earth? So I want to let you guys know, I have never actually heard any good arguments, by the way, not a single one. If you have one, I have never heard a single good argument for any of this behavior. Nobody's even bothered to try and give any from anybody in my family or anybody who was involved in that church. Not once. Anyway, fast forward 8 years or so, I was an atheist for a period of time. I had begun to heavily drink. I was sleeping around. I was doing anything I could to numb this pain. And I was trying so hard to suppress, numb. I wanted to feel some good feelings about my family. I wanted to feel any good feelings about my family. And I just couldn't. Instead, I just kept hearing more and more stories about stuff like this. And I just watched that church move on like nothing had happened. But I knew there was all this dirt. I knew that there was something severely wrong, and that ended up being true. That 8 years later, what ended up happening, and it was my dad who told me this story. So for those of you in my family who think that maybe I'm like making stuff up or whatever, you can talk to Dad about this. I remember I was at the bike shop and Dad sat me down and he said, and I actually really respect my dad for saying this, by the way. He said, Josh, you remember all that stuff you said about this pastor maybe being narcissistic or a sociopath? And he says, I gotta hand it to my dad on this, by the way. He says, I think you might have been right. I was like, it could have knocked me over. I was like, 8 years of ignoring warning after warning after warning. And like now you finally say, maybe I'm right. I'm like, what? Okay, this is great. But at the same time, what the heck? It took this long? Anyway, so I'm like, what happened? So apparently what happened was the pastor's wife cheated on him with the music director. classic love story, church love story there. And she started to explain to this, the way it started, I guess, was that she started to tell about all this abusive stuff that was happening at home. They started to have an affair, and the pastor apparently caught them and obviously blew up. And they ended up going to therapy. And during therapy, the therapist basically started to dig up all of this stuff that was going on behind the scenes. All the classic covert, or in this case, overt narcissist strategies. All the manipulation, the control, all this stuff. One other small story, by the way, that I heard during this 8-year period that's worth noting. Apparently, there was a point when the pastor's daughter went to one of the Sunday school classes, and the person who's leading the Sunday school class asked if there were prayer requests. And the pastor's daughter said, yeah, I want to pray that mommy would stop crying every time daddy comes home. So for the entire 8 years, I was in a state of numbing rage where I would go into I would drink, I would go into the shower, try and wash off this pain of knowing that this person not only existed, but that everybody in my family, my immediate family, was ignoring every ounce of warning I had given on this. And then I was being told I was going to hell because I was an atheist. So I was the bad guy. Not any of this, not covering up any of this stuff. I was the bad guy. Well, during these therapy sessions, the therapist and apparently what happened was the therapist uncovered all this stuff and started to focus their attention on the pastor instead of on the pastor's wife. And my dad said something crazy. I was baffled by this. So Dad, if you see this, honestly, when you said this, I was in shock. I had been growing up in this environment where everything was this rigid structure where you follow the rules exactly or else you get smacked. And my dad's response at this point, he must have changed a lot, was he said, when I found out all of the stuff that this pastor had been doing, I didn't blame his wife for cheating on him. And I was like, what? What sort of stuff was dug up? What ended up happening, by the way, was that this pastor actually ended up admitting to basically everything and supposedly actually became a real Christian a couple years later. Of course, no idea if this is true or not, but I do remember there was a video posted online at that point in time where this pastor was confessing to this stuff, that everything that was going on. So, fast forward to today. When I came back to faith, I thought that my relationship with my family would now be fixed. For some reason in my head, I thought that the problems that existed were related to the fact that I had been an atheist. And now that I was back to being a Christian, I thought that all those problems would go away. As many of you can probably figure out, they didn't go away. And if you're wondering what drives me right now, it's this story. It's this whole story. Because what I see in this story is how the devil can get into the church. Manipulation, control. Leviathan in the Old Testament is the twisted one, the coiling one. And I remember with some interactions with my immediate family, I remember feeling that same dark presence. Now, keep in mind, I'd come back to faith in 2019, right? And then I had a bunch of interactions with my family a couple years ago. And I remember that same feeling of that dark presence coming back, the one that had existed in my teens. And just feeling that tightening in my chest, that something was off. Something was off. why am I feeling this sensation that I didn't remember since my teens? And then, now what ended up happening was that my brother, one of my brothers, the same one who had basically commanded this friend not to talk to that elder who left, basically decided I was not allowed to pray at his house. I was not allowed to pray. Now he will claim it's not, he'll probably back off. Oh, no, I wasn't able to pray at meals. But the point was that he meant that now I was renting from him at the time. And he told me I wasn't, suddenly out of the blue, by the way, I'd been living at renting from him for months. And I noticed that every single time that we would get up to pray for meals, he would ask either my dad to pray or my other brother to pray, but he would never ask me to pray. And I started to notice this, and I was like, this is intentional. This is some of that shunning control stuff that I grew up with. So he comes to me one day and says, Josh, you're not allowed to pray over meals. And I was like, well, why? And he said, well, I'm afraid you'll be praying to the wrong God. And I was like, well, I believe in the same God you do. He goes, no, I don't think you do. We don't believe in praying to saints around here. And I was like, what the heck are you talking about? And I think what he did was he concluded that because I was actually sympathetic to Catholics, that I probably pray to saints. And I do actually ask for help from saints on occasion. Okay. But I definitely wasn't going to do that during a prayer with them. I mean, I respect my brother, I did. I respected my brother, and I wouldn't have done something like that. And around this time, I think when he told me that, I was like, wait, this problem still exists. This is deeper than I thought it was. And this got me to really thinking more about, quite frankly, about manipulation and control and narcissism and all this other stuff. And I was like, I am not going back to that. I am not going to go back to that environment. And I started to hear other stories. You would think that you'd get away from it, but then I started to gather these stories about things that had happened that I hadn't even heard of. And I'm starting to piece this all together, and I'm like, whoa, there is more going on here. And the secrecy, the things that have been covered up that I found out about, the way that people responded was basically like this. So we have our in-group of people, and that in-group of people is our little family unit, and we're never supposed to do anything that hurts the family unit. Okay? That means that, so if somebody outside the family unit does something really bad, well, that's because they're a sinner. But if somebody's inside our family unit and they do something really bad, well, we forgive them and we restore them. What? You're not supposed to show partiality. This is actually something that is repeatedly taught in the New Testament. You're never supposed to show partiality. Why are we being partial? And I started to just kind of piece together that none of this made any sense from forgive me, but from a biblical perspective. This control. Whatever happened to blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth? Whatever happened to mercy? Whatever happened to all of, just listening to the Holy Spirit, And I'm watching this, and I will tell you, why am I making this video today? Why am I bothering to go on to make this video? Well, it's been 4.5 years, and I'm coming up on the 7-year anniversary from my coming back to faith. And every single interaction that I have had with not every single interaction, but most of my interactions have just been a struggle. It's like there's still a power struggle going on with my siblings and with that entire sort of mindset. And I sort of pieced together that here's what happened. I was old enough to be able to kind of pick up what was going on when all this stuff went down in my teens. And I escaped it. And I think God helped me escape. He helped me to get out and get over to Sweden so I could look back on what was happening and I could understand really what was going on. And I think this was God's way of actually helping deliver me and set me free. But my siblings grew up in this environment where this pastor was seen as a top figure to be respected, to be imitated. And I think that they developed and they absorbed a whole bunch of those same mindsets. And so, gossip and backbiting and all this other stuff, all this manipulative stuff, and this extreme sort of biblical, almost tyrannical view of things has become normalized. And I know some of this is true because my little sister had a conversation with me earlier this year where she was bringing up some of the panic and anxiety stuff that I remember having growing up. And she was talking about it. And I was like, what in the world? So I know I'm not alone. I know that you, my siblings, if you watch this, you probably will, because I know that you guys are trying to figure out how to what's Josh doing next, and you're like, oh, what's he thinking? Look, guys, I am inviting you to be set free. Christ wants to set people free. You don't need to be involved in this. If any of you else is watching this, if you are involved in a high controlling church environment and you identify with any of the emotions or anything I have talked about in this video, know this. What God showed me through my experiences was that most of that was demonic. Okay? This stuff is demonic. It's controlling, it's manipulative, it's often connected with dark forces that are using religious principles to pull people down, to manipulate and control people, and to get them to the point where they feel despair and they feel trapped and they feel like their voice can't be heard and they feel like they can't think clearly and they feel like they're in a constant state of doubt and they're always wondering, am I really saved? Am I not saved? Am I doing things right? And everything like that. You can be free from all of this. None of this is Christianity. This is a fake form of Christianity, okay? This isn't real. It's all a facade. You can be set free. Watch my video where I talk about what I think now. So people disagree with each other. It's not the end of the world. Part of loving each other is you recognize that people disagree on things. It's just the way it is, okay? You don't have to make a final decision that you're not going to interact with someone anymore because they believe slightly differently. You can confess the controlling stuff you've done in the past. You can let it go. You don't have to try and control other people constantly. It can be just let it go, please. So, well, this video is either going to be one of those things that has a massive impact, or I'm going to regret making it, one of the two. But you know what? I've been carrying this stuff for so long now, and I just need to get it out there. And just tell the truth. Because truth is a disinfectant, and when you shine light and truth on things, it can set people free. And so, for the few people that may actually have made it to the end here, thank you for listening to me. I hope that my being truthful about things is a therapy session for you. I hope that it's something where you can take a step back and just look at your life and you can go, wait a minute, maybe my gut's actually right about this. Maybe my concerns about this church situation are actually accurate. Maybe I don't have to do exactly what the pastor told me to do in this situation or that situation. Oh, God in heaven, I don't know whether anything I've said in this video is useful. I hope it is. I pray that you would bless this video and anybody who listens to it. I hope that my honesty, my brutal and transparent honesty, is useful to at least one person. Amen, and have a good evening.